So as you know, throughout our history, enemies of the people of Israel have taken verses from the Torah, verses from our Bible, twisted them in such a way in order to make us look bad. It's a very simple thing to do. So, what verse do you think is the most dangerous in the Torah? Which is the one that our enemies have used frequently, twisting it to put us in a bad light? There are a lot of candidates, easily twisted, but today's Parsha had a verse that has been used throughout history in order to distort Jewish teachings. The verse is the following. It's right in today's Torah reading, as I said, chapter 21, verse 35. This is what it says. When a man's ox injures his neighbor's ox, and the ox dies, they shall sell the live ox and divide its price. They shall also divide the dead animal. Now you may wonder, what the heck is the problem in that verse? Right, he injures the ox, it dies, right? They sell the live ox, they divide its price. That's how they settle the problem. That is a verse that has been thrown up to the Jews by anti-Semites of the world throughout our history. It certainly sounds innocent enough, but where it runs into trouble is in the Talmudic interpretation. It says in the Hebrew, Re'ehu, the ox of your neighbor. However, our sages, in translating the word Re'ehu, do it very narrowly. And they determine that the law is only applicable when it involves your neighbor, your fellow Jew. If an ox damages a fellow Jew's ox, then he pays restitution. But if it is a Gentile's ox, no restitution is necessary. So you see where we're going, right? You hurt the ox of your fellow Jew, restitution. Non-Jew, forget it. That goes against what we just talked about before the Torah reading, that the Torah is Torah achat yelechem. The law is equal for everyone. So already in Talmudic times, our enemies held this interpretation against us. The Talmud tells us a story that once the Roman government sent a commission to the rabbis to examine the teachings of Judaism. The Romans were very interested in Jewish teachings, particularly before the rise of Christianity. After months of study, the commissioners reported that they found the Torah's teachings to be filled with truth, except for one verse of claiming restitution being obligatory only to fellow Jews and not a Gentile. If you Google this verse, which the Romans didn't get to do, right? But they found this verse and the interpretation. If you Google Exodus 21:35, you'll see anti-Semitic websites focusing on this verse. Or just type in revisionisthistory.org. It's a fascinating website. That's where they rewrite all of history. revisionisthistory.org. And look at the article entitled, Truth About the Talmud, Racist Rabbinic Hate Literature, right? In there, that verse is used to show how Jews discriminate against non-Jews. So how do we respond to this criticism? There are several answers that are offered. In the Talmud, one answer given is that even before the revelation at Mount Sinai, God had already imposed a minimum standard of civilization known as the 7 Noahide laws. The laws of Noah, basic moral values that apply. Remember, it's Noah, it's before there were any Hebrews, it's before the Jewish people. 7 laws that apply to all human beings. And one of them required creating a judicial system. However, as the rabbis explain, being that in those days, a Gentile was not a Gentile today. In those days, Gentiles were pagans, right? They worshipped idols. They had a completely different system of morals and values. And they didn't keep those Noahide laws. And being that they didn't impose any liability for damage done by cattle, they wouldn't expect Jews to act differently. In other words, the rabbis explain, the pagans didn't have any of these laws. They didn't obey any of these laws. They didn't expect the Jews to treat them the way they treated their fellow Jews because they thought our laws were ridiculous and they ignored them. Later on, a medieval commentator by the name of Meiri, and in more recent times, other commentators, offer this explanation. It is true that this and other laws in the Torah are discriminatory, but that was because in ancient days, the Gentiles were pagans and barbarians who were completely lawless. They were not to be treated the same way as law-abiding people, like our Jews were. But the Gentiles of our day, writes the Meiri in the Middle Ages, they are law-abiding people. They are Muslims and Christians, and they have morality and they have ethics. And so, says the Meiri, in our day the law is the same for Jew and Gentile. So he gives it historical perspective. The Torah is only talking about Jews and pagans, pagans who reject all basic morality and ethics. They're not talking about Western civilization, not talking about our period of time. In our period of time, the law applies equally to everyone. That's how they responded to the anti-Semites. Now, why am I teaching this lesson this morning, other than the fact it's our Torah reading? First of all, because it's very interesting to see how the rabbis wanted to make sure that Jews understood that this idea of treating Gentiles differently under the law no longer applied, because they're not pagans. They're not people who disregard rules and standards. They have laws, they have rules, they have standards, they have morality, they have ethics, they have a judicial system. However, it's not true of all people today. And this is the point. The enemy Israel faces today in Gaza are not to be considered amongst the Gentiles who have rules and standards like us, like Western civilization, like most Muslim countries, which have adopted Old Testament, or as we call it, the Hebrew Bible, morality. Hamas does not accept any international rules of ethics or morals. They don't accept any international rules of warfare. Hamas breaks every international moral value every single day, and breaks them big time. Everything they have done from October 7th on has been amongst the most illegal acts of war we have seen since World War II. There have been other brutal regimes like Pol Pot in Cambodia, Idi Amin in Ethiopia, and we could come up with other examples. But Hamas ranks right up there with the worst of them. Yet, many demand that Israel abide 100% by international laws of warfare. But you can't win a war if your enemy abides by no rules and you have to abide by all of the rules. We wouldn't have won World War II if we hadn't bombed civilian populations in Germany and Japan, because they were playing by different rules. Kamikaze in Japan shocked the West. You're committing suicide to kill our soldiers? This was unheard of. We didn't understand it, and the only response was to bring an end to the war as quickly as possible and save American lives and British lives. If we had fought according to the rules in World War II, we would have lost a minimum of another 100,000 American soldiers. Truman wasn't about to let that happen. But that is a choice they forced upon us. Hamas, by illegally taking civilians as hostages, by hiding behind innocent civilians in Gaza, by stealing most of the aid coming into Gaza. When they talk about starvation in Gaza, it has nothing to do with the amount of food getting in. There's plenty of food getting in. But it's hard to get it to the people who need it, to the civilians, because Hamas steals it and then sells it to their own civilians instead of giving it to them. By using schools, mosques, hospitals as storage for weapons and as command controls and to hide hostages, Hamas purposely puts civilians at risk, hoping the world will stop Israel from attacking, forcing a ceasefire which would leave Hamas in power. And then they would take in hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild Gaza. They'd steal most of it, rebuild the tunnels, and rebuild their war machine. In other words, if Israel is perfect in her observance of rules, international rules, that Hamas will not observe at all, she can't win. Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg puts it this way: if Israel is ethically 50% better than her enemies, she will be a light unto the nations. If Israel is 100% better than her enemies, she will be dead. That's the reality. The law in the Torah reading today, which tells us to treat under the law the pagans differently than our fellow Jews because they don't abide by any of the rules, is a perfect parallel to the situation we face today. Hamas observes no rules, but wants the world to force Israel to observe all of them. And that way, Hamas has its only hope of winning the war or surviving the war. And Israel cannot allow that and will not allow that. She is exceedingly careful in her attempts to limit civilian damage, but it's not always possible, unless she is accepting the idea of giving Hamas a victory by allowing the terror organization to remain in power. In spite of Hamas's attempts to get as many civilians killed as possible so the world will be outraged, Israel has a ratio of death to civilian soldiers, death of civilians to soldiers, lower than any modern war fought by any Western nation. Remember that part of the new definition of anti-Semitism accepted by the United Nations is holding Jews to a higher standard than other nations. Criticizing Israel for doing things in this war that other nations have done, even to a greater extent, but were never held accountable. That's anti-Semitic. Holding Israel to a higher standard than America holds itself, than the EU holds itself. That is why the president's statement the other night that Israel's response has been over the top was so damaging. And we're hoping he will walk it back, clarify it, for it's not consistent with anything he had said from October 7th until that moment. It's inconsistent. That's not been his position. It was a misstatement, and hopefully, as I said, he'll walk it back. Because it only feeds the narrative that civilian deaths in this war are somehow something extraordinary. Civilian deaths are regrettable, but they occur. And they are occurring at a lower ratio to soldier deaths than any other war. That's what official statistics have revealed. In fact, there are fewer civilian deaths in this phase of the war than in earlier phases. That's why you don't hear anything about it. They just keep on referring to what was, not what is. because in the earlier phase, bombing from the air was necessary to eliminate weapons, storage locations, command and control and missile launchers, to find and kill Hamas soldiers who were hiding amongst the civilians. There is far less of that in this new stage of the war. Now, there's another explanation for this verse that suggests we have to give preference to Jews over Gentiles, that I believe has a contemporary relevance. It's an explanation given by the great Jewish commentator, Nachmanides, known as Ramban, not Rambam, but Ramban. And he's writing in a different context regarding a similar law that seems to discriminate against non-Jews. He explains the reality is this: the law is not meant for us as Jews to treat Gentiles as being anything less than us. The law is only meant, says Nachmanides, to teach us to treat our fellow Jews a bit better than we would others. The reality is, in the case of the goring ox, the actual rule is no repayment should be expected of anyone. But when you're dealing with your fellow Jew, says Nachmanides, you're dealing with a member of your family, so you want to maintain a higher ethical paradigm than under other circumstances. So make a payment. It's your family. Make them feel good, but you don't have to according to the law. For example, if the Torah tells us we're not supposed to charge interest on a loan to a fellow Jew, everyone knows that. But you can charge interest to a non-Jew. It is really telling us that for the sake of business and an economy, charging interest is a necessity. You have to charge interest, or you're going to fail. You just don't charge interest when you're dealing with a member of your family. In other words, the law is you're allowed to charge interest. But with mishpacha, you can't do that. Don't charge interest. It's not nice. You bend over backwards to help your family. Little wonder that the verse in our Torah portion, if you lend money to my people, so the poor among you, do not act towards them as a creditor. If it be your own poor, if it be a relative, and the poor of your city, your own poor should be given preference to the poor of your city. If it be the poor of your city and the poor of another city, the rabbis say, the poor of your city should be given preference. For it is said to the poor among you. Meaning, first you take care of your own, then you take care of others. So let me give you an example. Everyone who lives in this city, every Jew, every Gentile, should give to United Way. Because United Way takes care of everyone in need in our community, and we're members of this community. So we make our United Way contribution. These are our fellow citizens, Jew and Gentile alike. But we give more to Federation. Why? It's family. That's why we give more. We help our family more than we help others. Because if their family helps their families, everybody will be okay. That's what the Torah is teaching. It's not that we treat them less. It's just that we treat our fellow Jews, our family, a little bit better because they are family. So what does it mean to bend over backward for your own family? Do you know that what it means to be there for your re'ah, your neighbor, your friend, in this time of need? I give you a great example. It's a sports, and I like sports examples. From the Texas Rangers. A number of years ago, remember the Texas Rangers had a great season. They don't usually have great seasons, so it was a big deal. They had celebrated 2 postseason series victories. They hadn't had a postseason victory in a long time. So how do you celebrate in the locker room? We all know. They pop open the bottles of champagne, and it bursts into the air, and they pour it on each other, and they drink. And that's the big celebration. Well, the Texas Rangers did not use champagne. They used ginger ale. Ginger ale? Why did they use ginger ale? Because one of their teammates, in fact, he was the American League most valuable player that year, Josh Hamilton, is a recovering drug and alcohol addict. So they decided to give up champagne for his sake, in his honor. They thought that's the least they could do to show solidarity with a teammate. That's giving preference to your neighbor, your friend, your family. We as Jews have a twofold obligation. We are implored to exhibit love of humanity, ahavat habriot, love of all created in the image of God. But at the same time, we have a special mandate to exhibit ahavat Yisrael, a special love for our fellow Jews, for our own. Yes, not just our own, but our own come first, as reflected in the immortal words of Hillel. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? First, I take care of myself, and then I take care of others. First, my family, then my community. So we have learned from today's portion that Israel must be as compassionate and as fair as possible when dealing with others, but not so compassionate that she gives the enemy the upper hand, because that enemy does ignore every rule of civilization and war. And we have learned that we need to take care of our community, but take even greater care of our fellow Jews. A 3,000-year-old text explicated by the rabbis 2,000 years ago is filled with wisdom. Far more wisdom than we hear from modern pundits and moralists who think that calling for the genocide of the Jewish people might be acceptable speech on our college campuses if it's done in the proper context. They should have studied the Bible, for without it they've become moral idiots. They should study more Torah, because it could give them a better context to learn real morals, real values, and real ethics. Shabbat Shalom.